The forest was silent, a suffocating kind of silence that pressed against Elliot Grayson's chest as he ventured deeper into its shadowy heart. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, like rusted iron. His flashlight beam danced across twisted trees, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the night sky. Legend spoke of this place, the forbidden woods that locals called the Bone Hollow, home to the elusive bone collector, a figure as much myth as nightmare. Armed with nothing but his camera and a growing sense of dread, Elliot was determined to uncover the truth. As he tread carefully along the overgrown path, the world around him seemed to shift. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots suddenly sounded deafening. He stopped, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. There it was, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, a dry, rattling noise, like bones clicking together. He turned sharply, his flashlight illuminating nothing but the dark trunks of trees. The noise stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence once more. Ahead, his light caught something strange, a crude structure, barely visible through the thickets. As he approached, his pulse quickened. It wasn't a house or a cabin. It was an altar, crudely assembled from stones smeared with a dark substance that had long since dried. Arranged around the altar were bones of various shapes and sizes, some human, others too deformed to identify. Strung between the trees were strings of bones, clinking together softly in the breeze, creating a haunting melody that seemed alive. Elliot's breath quickened as he stepped closer. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the altar. He felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, as if the stones themselves were calling him. Just as he reached out to touch one of the runes carved into the altar's surface, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't wind. It was a low, guttural moan, resonating from every direction. He froze, his hand trembling inches from the stone. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. They echoed through the darkness, growing louder with each step. Elliot swung his flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the night, but revealing nothing. His throat tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's just the wind, just the wind." But deep down, he knew better. The footsteps were real. They were coming closer. The oppressive silence was shattered by a voice, low and rasping, like dried leaves crumbling underfoot. "Why are you here?" Elliot spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The beam of his flashlight landed on a figure standing just beyond the edge of the altar. Cloaked in shadows, it wore what seemed to be a hooded robe stitched together from pieces of leather and bark. From beneath the hood, 2 pinpoints of faint, glowing red light peered directly at him. The voice came again, chilling and deliberate. "Do you know what happens to those who disturb the hollow?" Elliot stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The altar behind him seemed to pulse, the runes glowing faintly, as if feeding on the fear radiating from him. A sharp, bitter wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself were holding him captive. The figure took a step closer, the sound of cracking bones accompanying its movement. Elliot tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. All he could do was watch as the figure raised a hand, skeletal with long, bony fingers, pointing directly at him. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, and suddenly, the altar erupted with light, casting a harsh red glow that illuminated the forest in grotesque detail. Every tree seemed to twist and writhe as if alive, and the bone wind chimes clattered violently, creating a cacophony of sound that drowned out Elliot's thoughts. He turned and ran, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he sprinted through the forest, the glowing red light of the altar fading behind him. But the footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, echoing louder with each passing moment. No matter how far or how fast he ran, the sound remained constant, as if the entity were right behind him, breathing down his neck. Finally, he burst into a clearing and fell to his knees, gasping for air. When he dared to look back, the forest was still and silent again, the oppressive atmosphere gone. But in the distance, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, he saw the altar, and the hooded figure standing motionless beside it, watching him. Shaking, Elliot reached for his camera and muttered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Elliot sat on the cold forest ground, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to calm the storm of fear inside him. The oppressive silence returned, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. As his flashlight flickered weakly, he fumbled with his camera, desperate to document what he had just witnessed. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Something deep within him screamed to turn back, but his curiosity burned brighter than his terror. He had come too far to stop now. The distant glow of the altar still haunted the edges of his vision, a sickly red that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Gathering his courage, Elliot rose to his feet and pushed forward, deeper into the forest. His steps felt heavier, as if the ground itself was reluctant to let him move. Then out of nowhere he saw it, a crumbling cabin hidden in the shadows, its wooden walls twisted and blackened as if scorched by fire. The windows were shattered, and the doorway hung ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. Approaching cautiously, Elliot felt a chilling draft emanating from the cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something oddly familiar. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his weight. The interior was suffocatingly dark, but his flashlight revealed a disturbing sight. Bones, hundreds of them, lined the walls, arranged in intricate patterns that resembled runes and symbols. Skulls grinned from every corner, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow his every move. His stomach churned, but it was the object at the center of the room that made him freeze in place. There, on a rotting wooden table, sat a small, weathered music box. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols that matched those on the altar. Elliot's heart pounded as a memory clawed its way to the surface of his mind, a memory he had buried long ago. He recognized the music box. It had belonged to his mother, who used to wind it up every night when he was a child. The haunting melody would play softly as she sang a lullaby to him. But this made no sense. The box had been lost years ago, buried with her in the cemetery on the outskirts of town. As if drawn by an invisible force, Elliot reached out and touched the box. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the lid snapped open, and the melody began to play, a slow, distorted version of the lullaby he remembered so well. The sound sent chills racing down his spine, and tears welled in his eyes. The memory of his mother's voice flooded his mind, but with it came something darker, a forgotten night, long ago, when he had wandered into the cemetery alone. He remembered seeing a shadowy figure digging in the earth, its skeletal hands pulling bones from the ground with methodical precision. He had been too scared to move, but the figure had turned to him, its glowing eyes burning into his soul. The next thing he remembered was waking up at home, his arm marked with a jagged scar he couldn't explain. Now, standing in the eerie cabin, Elliot looked down at his arm. The scar, long faded, began to burn. He winced, pulling up his sleeve to reveal the jagged line glowing faintly, the same sickly red as the altar. A cold voice echoed through the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You were chosen long ago, Elliot. The bond cannot be broken." His flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic clawed at him as the music box continued to play, its haunting tune growing louder, almost mocking him. Shadows began to shift around the room, their shapes twisting into grotesque figures that reached for him with elongated, skeletal arms. Elliot stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of bones that clattered to the floor with a sickening sound. Desperation overtook him, and he grabbed the music box, clutching it tightly. The shadows froze, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The melody stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. In that moment, he realized the box was more than a relic of his past. It was a key, a connection to the dark forces that had haunted him since childhood. The glow from his scar pulsed in time with the eerie red light that now seeped through the cracks of the cabin walls. Outside, the forest came alive with whispers, voices overlapping in a cacophony of pain and despair. Elliot ran to the doorway, but the path he had taken was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gnarled trees. The whispers grew louder, resolving into a single chilling phrase. "He waits for you at the altar." Elliot's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Why had the music box appeared here, in this cursed place? What connection did his mother have to the bone collector? And why had he been marked all those years ago? Questions swirled in his head, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. The forest was alive, watching, waiting, and it would not let him leave until he uncovered the truth. Clutching the music box, Elliot stepped back into the oppressive darkness of the forest, the whispers guiding him toward the glowing red light in the distance. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was dragging him closer to the horrors that awaited. And as the lullaby began to play faintly in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel that he was walking straight into the jaws of something ancient and unspeakably evil. Elliot stumbled forward, the oppressive whispers of the forest growing louder with every step. The music box in his hand felt impossibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of centuries of pain and sorrow. The scar on his arm pulsed with a fiery intensity, sending jolts of searing heat through his body. The crimson glow of the altar loomed ahead, casting grotesque shadows across the gnarled trees that surrounded him. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back, to flee from the horrifying unknown. But something deeper, something primal, kept pulling him closer. When he reached the clearing, the altar stood before him like a monument to madness. The bones arranged around its base seemed to shift and twist, forming unnatural shapes that defied logic. The runes carved into the stones glowed brighter as Elliot approached, as if responding to his presence. The air was thick with a metallic scent, and the sound of dry, clicking bones echoed around him, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. As he stood there, paralyzed by fear, the whispers of the forest coalesced into a single voice. It was low and guttural, filled with malice and despair. "The choice is yours, Elliot. Your blood has already been marked. Will you sacrifice your past, or let the darkness claim your future?" Elliot's hands trembled as he held the music box closer to his chest. The voice seemed to come from the altar itself, reverberating through his skull like a relentless drumbeat. He looked down at the scar on his arm, the glowing red line pulsating in time with the rhythm of the voice. His mind raced, memories flashing before his eyes, his mother's smile, her lullabies, the warmth of her embrace. But mixed with these comforting images were darker ones. The cemetery, the shadowy figure digging up bones, and the sense of being watched that had haunted him his entire life. The voice spoke again, more insistent this time. "Choose, or the forest will choose for you." The ground beneath him began to shift, the earth cracking open to reveal jagged roots that writhed like serpents. Elliot stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Suddenly, the music box in his hand sprang to life, its haunting melody filling the clearing. The sound was warped, echoing unnaturally, and as it played, the air around him seemed to distort. Shadows emerged from the trees, figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, their forms flickering like dying flames. They reached for him, their fingers elongating unnaturally, their mouths opening in silent screams. Elliot's mind reeled as the voice demanded once more, "To stop the curse, you must give us what binds you to this world." He understood now. The altar required a piece of him, a memory, a fragment of his soul. The music box represented everything he held dear about his past, the last tangible connection to his mother. Sacrificing it would mean losing those memories forever, erasing the warmth and comfort they provided. But if he refused, the darkness would claim him entirely, reducing him to one of the shadowy figures now circling the clearing. The shadows drew closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The ground beneath his feet cracked further, the roots snaking toward him, their tips glistening with an otherworldly light. Elliot clenched his jaw, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. "What happens if I choose neither?" he demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. The voice laughed, a sound that was neither human nor beast. "Then you will join us. Forever." Elliot's breath caught as one of the shadows lunged at him, its elongated fingers grazing his arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a wave of numbness through his body. He stumbled back, clutching the music box tighter. He had no choice. If he didn't act, the forest would consume him. Tears streamed down his face as he opened the music box one last time. The melody played, its notes slow and mournful, each one like a dagger to his heart. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. With trembling hands, he placed the music box on the altar. The runes flared brighter, and the shadows froze, their hollow eyes fixed on the offering. The ground trembled violently, and a deafening roar filled the clearing as the music box shattered into 1,000 glowing shards. The light consumed the altar, the bones, and the shadows, leaving Elliot blinded and trembling. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The altar was gone, the shadows vanished, and the forest was eerily silent once more. But something was missing. Elliot clutched at his chest, his heart aching with a hollow pain. He tried to recall his mother's face, her voice, her lullaby, but the memories were gone, like a dream slipping through his fingers. And yet, the scar on his arm no longer glowed. The curse had been lifted, or so it seemed. The forest allowed him to leave, but as he stumbled back to the edge of the woods, he felt a presence lingering, a weight that pressed against his soul. He had made his choice, but the darkness had taken more than just his memories. As Elliot emerged from the forest, he looked back one last time. In the distance, faint and flickering, he saw the crimson glow of the altar reappear. The voice echoed in his mind, soft and taunting, "You may have escaped, but you will never be free." The forest had grown deathly quiet as Elliot staggered through the tangled undergrowth. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening with every step. Though the altar's glow had faded behind him, the oppressive atmosphere of the woods lingered. The shadows stretched unnaturally, their edges sharp and jagged, shifting as if they had lives of their own. The silence wasn't calming. It was a void, filled with a tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Elliot's scar, though no longer glowing, still burned faintly, like an ember smoldering under his skin. Each step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown, as if the forest had rearranged itself to trap him within its labyrinth. Then, breaking the silence, came the first sound, a faint whisper, too soft to be understood. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around him like an invisible mist. He froze, spinning in place, trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest remained as empty and lifeless as before. Suddenly, the whisper grew louder, morphing into an eerie chorus of overlapping voices. The words were indistinct at first, a jumble of syllables that sent shivers racing down his spine. But as the whispers grew clearer, they began to form phrases, chilling in their clarity. He watches. He waits. You are not alone. Elliot's flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as if the batteries were being drained by an unseen force. He swung the light wildly around, but the shadows seemed to shift faster than the beam could follow. A rustling sound echoed from the trees, dry and sharp, like leaves crunching underfoot. His heart raced as he turned toward the sound, his mind screaming that someone, or something, was watching him. From the corner of his eye, Elliot caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure darting between the trees, its form too quick and fluid to be human. He whipped the flashlight in its direction, but it revealed nothing but the still forest. The whispers surged again, louder now, almost taunting him. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves, but the air around him had grown colder, his breath visible in the faint light. And then he heard it, his mother's voice. Elliot. It was soft, almost tender, as if she were calling to him from another room. The sound froze him in place, his blood turning to ice. He knew it couldn't be real. He had sacrificed her memory, her voice, her presence, all of it back at the altar. And yet, it was unmistakably her. Elliot, come here. The voice was closer now, laced with an urgency that sent chills down his spine. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound, his legs moving as if guided by some unseen force. Each step seemed to pull him deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight entirely. The whispers began to merge into a low hum, resonating deep within his chest. The voice of his mother grew fainter, replaced by something far more sinister, a guttural, rasping tone that echoed with malice. You cannot escape. You belong to us. Elliot stumbled into a clearing, his flashlight flickering out completely. He was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from faintly glowing runes carved into the ground around him. They pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the clearing. The whispers became a roar, an overwhelming cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. He clutched his head, desperate to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement again. A figure began to take shape at the edge of the clearing, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate gait. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and skeletal. Its face was obscured by a hood, but from beneath it, two glowing red eyes stared directly at him, piercing through the darkness. The whispers ceased in an instant, replaced by a suffocating silence. The figure raised one bony hand, pointing directly at Elliot. Its voice, deep and reverberating, filled the clearing. You open the door. Now you must face what lies beyond. The ground beneath him began to quake, the runes glowing brighter with each passing second. Shadows erupted from the edges of the clearing, writhing and twisting like living entities. They reached for him, their forms shifting and contorting into grotesque shapes. Elliot tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very earth was holding him in place. The whispers returned, but this time they were inside his head, echoing through his thoughts like a dark tide. He could feel his sanity slipping, his grip on reality fraying as the shadows closed in. In the distance, faint and distorted, he heard his mother's voice one last time. Elliot, I'm sorry. And then, the figure spoke again, its tone filled with finality. The forest has claimed you. There is no escape. The shadows enveloped him, the cold seeping into his bones as the world around him dissolved into darkness. He screamed, but no sound came, swallowed by the void that surrounded him. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him entirely was the figure, standing motionless, its glowing eyes watching him with an unyielding gaze. And then, everything went silent. Elliot awoke to an unnatural stillness, his body sprawled on the forest floor. The ground beneath him was cold and damp, the scent of decaying leaves thick in the air. His head throbbed with pain, and his limbs felt heavy, as though the shadows themselves had drained the strength from him. When he opened his eyes, he found himself surrounded by an endless expanse of trees, their twisted branches stretching toward the heavens like skeletal arms. The crimson glow of the altar was gone, but an oppressive darkness lingered, wrapping around him like a shroud. For a moment, he thought he was alone, but then the whispers returned. Soft at first, like a faint breeze brushing past his ears, they grew louder, taking on a distinctly human tone. The voices were distorted, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. They whispered his name, hissed secrets he couldn't understand, and mocked him with laughter that chilled him to his core. As he staggered to his feet, Elliot realized that the forest wasn't just watching him. It was alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving unnaturally fast, disappearing whenever he tried to focus on them. The air grew colder, and his breath came out in short, visible puffs. Then, the whispers began to change. Instead of nonsensical murmurs, they formed coherent sentences, their words cutting through his resolve like a blade. "You're weak, Elliot. You've always been weak." The voice was his own, distorted but unmistakable. It echoed his deepest fears, pulling memories from the recesses of his mind. He saw flashes of his childhood, moments of failure, times when he had disappointed those he cared about. The whispers became a torrent of accusations, dredging up every regret and insecurity he had ever buried. "You let her die," the voice hissed. "You couldn't save her." His mother's face flashed before him, her kind smile replaced by an expression of pain and despair. Elliot shook his head violently, trying to dispel the visions, but they only grew stronger. The shadows around him began to take shape, forming grotesque figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. They circled him like predators, their twisted faces reflecting his worst fears. One shadow stepped forward, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke. Its face was a grotesque mirror of his own, twisted into a sneer. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice dripping with malice. "But you'll never leave. The forest owns you now." Elliot clenched his fists, trying to summon the courage to fight back, but the whispers intensified, overwhelming him with their venom. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, clutching his head as the voices clawed at his sanity. The shadows loomed closer, their forms becoming more solid, more real. They reached for him with clawed hands, their touch cold and suffocating. Suddenly, one of the shadows stopped and tilted its head, as if studying him. It whispered in a voice eerily similar to his mother's, "Do you want to see her again?" Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The shadows around him froze, their hollow eyes watching intently. The voice continued, soft and tempting. "She's waiting for you. Just give in. Let go of your fear." The air grew colder, and Elliot felt a pull deep within his chest, a magnetic force drawing him toward the shadow. His mother's voice called to him again, faint but undeniable. "Elliot, come to me." Tears streamed down his face as he reached out, his hand trembling. He knew it couldn't be real. He had sacrificed her memory at the altar. She was gone. And yet, the temptation was overwhelming. The thought of seeing her again, of feeling her warmth, was more than he could bear. But as his fingers brushed against the shadow, a surge of cold shot through him, and the illusion shattered. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing and contorting into something monstrous. Its face twisted into a grotesque grin, and its voice turned guttural and mocking. "You're so easy to break," it hissed. "Your fear will consume you." The other shadows closed in, their laughter echoing through the forest. Elliot scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The forest wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was using it against him, twisting his thoughts and memories into weapons. He realized that every vision, every whisper, was designed to break him, to make him surrender to the darkness. Clutching his chest, he forced himself to focus. "This isn't real," he muttered through gritted teeth. "It's all in my head." The shadows froze, their movements jerky and unnatural. The forest seemed to recoil, as if his defiance had disrupted its grip on him. The whispers grew fainter, replaced by an ominous silence. But then a single voice spoke, deep and resonant, filling the air like a thunderclap. "Your fear may not destroy you, but it will lead you to me." The ground beneath him began to crack, glowing with the same sickly red light as the altar. Elliot stumbled back, but the earth gave way, and he fell into darkness. As he plummeted, the shadows followed, their laughter echoing around him like a chorus of the damned. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the clearing, the altar glowing faintly in the distance. The music box lay shattered at its base, its broken melody echoing through the air. The forest was still, but the oppressive weight of the shadows lingered, a constant reminder that his fear had only just begun to reveal its true power. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered toward the glowing altar, his legs trembling under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The oppressive whispers had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt far more sinister. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching and waiting for what would come next. The faint crimson glow of the runes on the altar cast long, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally across the clearing, as if mocking the laws of nature. He clutched the remnants of the shattered music box in his trembling hands, the jagged pieces digging into his skin. Blood dripped from his fingers, each drop hissing as it hit the ground, evaporating into a faint, acrid mist. The scar on his arm burned hotter than ever, pulsing in time with the faint hum emanating from the altar. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its energy converging on this single, cursed spot. Elliot felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw the figure from before, the tall, hooded entity whose glowing red eyes had haunted him since the beginning. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its skeletal hand extended toward him, its voice low and guttural. "You have seen the truth," it intoned. "Now you must face it." Before Elliot could respond, the figure stepped forward, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. The runes on the altar flared brighter, their glow illuminating the clearing in a sickly red light. The shadows around the trees began to move again, writhing like living things. They twisted and merged, forming grotesque shapes that resembled tortured faces, their mouths open in silent screams. Elliot's pulse quickened as he stepped back, but his retreat was halted by the sound of a child's laughter, a light, innocent sound that seemed completely out of place. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, and saw a small figure standing near the altar. It was a young boy, no older than 7, with dark eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. The boy's face was eerily familiar, and Elliot's stomach churned as he realized why. The boy was him. The child smiled, a cold, hollow expression that sent a chill racing down Elliot's spine. "You remember, don't you?" the boy said, his voice high-pitched and echoing unnaturally. "You saw it that night in the cemetery. You watched it take her, and you did nothing." Elliot's mind reeled as fragmented memories surfaced, his mother's face twisted in fear, the shadowy figure pulling her into the darkness, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had consumed him as a child. The scar on his arm flared, and he dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the memories overwhelmed him. The boy stepped closer, his bare feet leaving faint scorch marks on the ground. "You could have saved her," he said, his tone cold and accusatory. "But you were too afraid." "No!" Elliot shouted, his voice breaking. "I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do." The boy laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the clearing. "You still don't. You're just as weak now as you were then." The hooded figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on Elliot. "He speaks the truth," it said. "Your fear is your greatest weakness. It binds you to this place, to me. But it can also be your greatest strength, if you let it." Elliot looked up, his vision blurred with tears. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. The figure extended its skeletal hand, pointing to the altar. "Offer your fear," it said. "Let go of the guilt, the pain, the weakness. Only then can you be free." The ground beneath the altar cracked open, revealing a chasm filled with writhing shadows. The faces within the darkness screamed silently, their hollow eyes staring up at Elliot. The runes on the altar pulsed faster, the hum growing louder until it was deafening. Elliot felt the weight of the music box in his hand. It was all he had left of his mother, the last connection to a past he could barely remember. To sacrifice it would mean letting go of the fear and guilt that had defined him, but it would also mean losing the part of himself that still clung to her memory. The boy stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Do it," he whispered, "or stay here forever. Just like me." Elliot's hands shook as he placed the shattered music box on the altar. The moment it touched the surface, the runes flared brighter than ever, blinding him with their light. The hum reached a crescendo, and the shadows screamed in unison, their forms twisting and writhing as they were pulled into the chasm. The hooded figure stepped forward, its voice booming over the chaos. "You have chosen. Now face the consequences." The ground beneath Elliot collapsed, and he fell into the darkness, the screams of the shadows echoing around him. His mind was flooded with memories, his mother's face, the night in the cemetery, the terror that had followed him ever since. And then just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Elliot opened his eyes to find himself standing alone in the clearing. The altar was gone, and the forest was silent. The scar on his arm had faded, leaving only a faint outline, but the weight in his chest remained, a hollow ache that reminded him of what he had lost. As he turned to leave, he heard the boy's voice one last time, faint and distant. "You'll never escape, Elliot." Not completely. And as he stepped into the shadows of the forest, he felt the presence lingering behind him, a constant reminder of the fear he had faced, and the darkness that would always follow. The forest felt different now. The oppressive weight in the air had shifted, but it hadn't lifted. Elliot stood in the clearing, staring at the void where the altar had once been. The ground was scarred with deep cracks, faint embers glowing within, as if the earth itself still simmered with malevolence. The shadows that had once pursued him were gone, but their absence felt like the calm before a storm. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, twisting through the trees like a cold wind. They no longer mocked him, they mourned. The forest seemed to cry out in anguish, as if mourning its loss, or preparing for something far worse. Elliot's scar, now faded, throbbed faintly as he turned in a slow circle, searching for the source of the whispers. And then he saw it. Emerging from the blackened trees, the hooded figure returned, its skeletal frame silhouetted by an unnatural crimson glow. This time it wasn't alone. Behind it, the shadows began to coalesce, forming monstrous shapes with elongated limbs, hollow eyes, and grotesque, ever-shifting faces. Their presence turned the air icy, each breath Elliot took condensing in the cold, oppressive air. The figure stepped forward, its glowing red eyes fixed on Elliot. Its voice cut through the whispers like a blade. "You have taken the first step, but the bond is not yet broken. The choice you made has awakened something far older than fear." Elliot took a step back, his hands clenched into fists. "What are you talking about? I did what you asked. I let go." The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "You think you are free, but your fear has only opened the door. Now you must face what lies beyond." The ground beneath Elliot's feet trembled, cracks spreading outward like veins. From the earth, a shape began to rise, a grotesque mass of bone and shadow, its form shifting and twisting as it emerged. The entity towered above him, its surface adorned with jagged spikes and carved runes that glowed with the same crimson light as the altar. From within its hollow chest, faint whispers emanated, the voices of countless souls trapped within its grotesque form. Elliot's chest tightened as he stared at the monstrosity. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The hooded figure raised its skeletal hand, gesturing toward the creature. "This is the darkness you unleashed. It is bound to you, and you to it. Only one of you will leave this place." The creature let out a deafening roar, its hollow chest expanding as the voices of the trapped souls screamed in unison. It lunged forward with impossible speed, its clawed hand swiping through the air. Elliot dove to the side just in time, the force of the blow sending him sprawling across the cracked ground. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and every breath burned his lungs. Desperate, he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had no weapons, no way to fight something this powerful. But as he looked at the creature, he noticed something, a faint light emanating from the broken music box fragments still scattered across the ground. Each shard pulsed weakly, as if calling to him. Elliot lunged toward the nearest shard, the creature's shadow looming over him. Just as its claw came down, he grasped the fragment and felt a surge of energy course through him. The shard glowed brighter, and the creature recoiled, its roar turning into a guttural snarl. Elliot realized the truth. The music box wasn't just a relic of his past. It was a piece of the bond that connected him to the forest, to the darkness. One by one, he gathered the shards, each piece growing brighter as he did. The creature's attacks grew more frantic, its movements erratic as it tried to stop him. Shadows lashed out, clawing at his arms and legs, but Elliot pushed through the pain, driven by a newfound determination. When he collected the final shard, the pieces began to merge, reforming into a glowing object that pulsed with warmth. It wasn't the music box anymore. It was something new, something alive. The light emanating from it burned away the shadows, forcing the creature to retreat. Its once imposing form now flickered and twisted, as if struggling to maintain its shape. Elliot stepped forward, holding the glowing object high. "You don't control me anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the fear still clawing at his chest. This ends now. The creature let out a final, desperate roar, its form collapsing inward as the light consumed it. The shadows screamed, their voices fading into silence as the forest grew still. The ground stopped trembling, and the cracks sealed themselves, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth. Elliot stood alone in the clearing, the glowing object in his hands dimming until it disappeared entirely. The hooded figure was gone, as were the whispers and the shadows. The forest, though still dark and twisted, felt lighter, as if the weight of centuries of malice had been lifted. As he turned to leave, Elliot heard a faint voice behind him, soft and familiar. "You are free, but freedom comes at a cost." He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The voice was his own. And as he walked out of the forest, he felt the lingering presence of something watching him. Not malevolent, but not entirely gone. The bond was broken, but a part of the darkness would always remain, a shadow within his soul, whispering softly in the depths of his mind. Elliot emerged from the forest, just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The golden glow of the rising sun seemed alien, almost intrusive, after the suffocating darkness of the woods. His clothes were torn, his skin scratched and bruised, and a dull ache lingered in his chest where fear and despair had made their home. Yet he felt no relief, only an unsettling quiet, as if the forest had let him leave but kept a piece of him behind. Turning back, he gazed at the treeline. The forest stood silent, its twisted branches motionless in the morning air. The oppressive whispers had ceased, but Elliot could still feel their echoes in the corners of his mind, faint and teasing. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a fleeting shadow that disappeared the instant he blinked. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the unease clung to him like a second skin. Elliot's thoughts turned to the hooded figure, the grotesque creature, and the shattered music box that had transformed into something he couldn't fully comprehend. What had he truly defeated? Was the bond really broken, or had it simply shifted, leaving him with a connection he couldn't yet understand? As he touched the faded scar on his arm, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if the forest wasn't done with him? When he returned to town, the locals greeted him with a mix of relief and suspicion. They had warned him not to enter the woods, told him about the legends of the bone collector and the cursed forest. Some avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves as he passed. Others stared at him, their eyes wide with fear, as if they could sense the darkness that still lingered in his presence. Elliot tried to move on, burying himself in his work, but the memories of the forest refused to fade. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the whispers of the shadows still echoing in his ears. At times, he could swear he saw the hooded figure in the periphery of his vision, always watching but never approaching. The scar on his arm, though faded, would occasionally throb with a dull ache, a reminder of the bond that had once tied him to the forest. Desperate for answers, Elliot began researching the history of the Bone Hollow. He uncovered stories of other wanderers who had entered the forest and never returned. Some spoke of ancient rituals meant to bind an unspeakable evil, while others hinted at a curse that preyed on those who carried fear in their hearts. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The forest's darkness wasn't just an isolated entity. It was ancient, woven into the very fabric of the land, and its reach extended far beyond the treeline. One night, as Elliot pored over an old journal he had discovered in the local archives, a chilling revelation surfaced. The entries described a ritual eerily similar to what he had experienced. An offering, a confrontation with a monstrous entity, and a choice. But the final passage stopped him cold. The forest never lets go. It marks those who survive, binding them to its will. They carry the darkness within, spreading its whispers wherever they go. Elliot's blood ran cold. He looked down at his hands, trembling as the weight of the words sank in. Was that his fate? To become an unwitting agent of the forest, a vessel for its lingering malice? He thought of the shadowy figures he had seen in the clearing, the hollow-eyed forms that had once been human. Had they all made the same mistake, believing they had escaped, only to realize too late that they were still part of the forest's design? The whispers returned that night, faint but insistent, seeping into his dreams. He found himself standing at the edge of the forest, the crimson glow of the altar visible in the distance. The hooded figure appeared, its skeletal hand outstretched. "You are free," it said, its voice a mixture of malice and sorrow. "But freedom is not without cost. You will carry us with you, always." Elliot woke with a start, his chest heaving as the final words echoed in his mind. He stared out the window at the dark silhouette of the forest, its twisted branches unmoving in the still night. He knew he couldn't go back, but he also couldn't escape. The forest had marked him, and its presence would remain, a shadow in his soul. As the days turned into weeks, Elliot noticed strange occurrences around him. Lights flickered in his home, objects moved inexplicably, and faint whispers filled the silence when he was alone. At first, he dismissed them as paranoia, remnants of the trauma he had endured. But deep down, he knew the truth. The forest had followed him. One evening, as he walked through the empty streets of town, he passed by a shop window and caught his reflection. For a moment, he saw something else staring back at him, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a faint crimson glow where its heart should be. He blinked, and the vision was gone, replaced by his own pale, haunted face. Elliot turned away, his heart heavy with dread. He had survived the forest, but at what cost? The mystery of the Bone Hollow remained unsolved, its darkness spreading quietly, invisibly, like roots burrowing deep into the earth. And as he walked away, the faint sound of a music box played in the distance, its haunting melody a reminder that the forest was never far behind. The forest had let him leave, but it had not let him go.